The Galactic Medical Academy had been preparing for this day for months. The academy, known for its strict curriculum and prestigious reputation, was about to welcome a student unlike any other, human, and specifically, from Earth, a place known across the galaxy as a death world, a planet where survival was an everyday struggle against hostile creatures, harsh environments, and brutal natural disasters. This was not a species many people had ever thought of as peaceful, or even more surprisingly, as capable of being medical experts. And yet there was Corporal Jamie Rook, a former combat medic, now entering the realm of advanced xenomedical studies, the first human to ever join this prestigious institution. From the moment Jamie stepped foot in the academy's vast, gleaming halls, his presence made waves. The other students, mostly from peaceful planets with lush landscapes and controlled environments, could hardly believe their eyes. They had seen humans before, rarely, and always with some level of fear. But this human was different. Corporal Rook was tall, solid, and radiated an air of unshakable calm that caught everyone off guard. Most of the students had prepared themselves for the cultural shock of meeting the human. What they didn't expect was the cultural shock of his very presence. The first class Jamie attended was Basic First Aid, a topic everyone assumed would be an easy introduction for him. After all, how hard could it be to patch up minor injuries and broken bones, right? The aliens in the class were ready to breeze through it. They had studied these procedures countless times, and many of them came from species that didn't face dangerous wildlife or extreme conditions. First aid was something they learned for safety, not survival. But when Jamie stepped into the classroom, the atmosphere shifted. There was no easy introduction. There was only a deep, unspoken tension as the students stared at him, wondering just what this death-worlder could teach them. Jamie didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight to the subject, pulling out various tools from his worn backpack. As he laid them on the table, the other students began to whisper, trying to figure out what each item was. Some of them had never seen most of the objects before. A jagged metal rod that looked like a broken knife. A small, dull-looking tool that had no clear purpose. A strange substance wrapped in cloth, smelling faintly of herbs and chemicals. The class was silent, with no one daring to ask what these items were. Jamie smiled slightly as he looked around the room, sensing their hesitation. He picked up the first object, a rugged piece of metal, and began his demonstration. This, he began, is a makeshift splint. Not ideal, but it works when there's no other option. His hands moved with ease, showing them how to attach the splint to a simulation of an injured arm. He explained that on Earth, in the middle of a battle or a survival situation, the use of tools and even one's own clothes was often the difference between life and death. His tone was calm, almost indifferent, yet the gravity of his words struck each alien student like a sudden blow. For the first time, they realized that to humans, survival was not a matter of skill or science. It was a matter of sheer will. It was then that they understood. Humans didn't just react to injuries. They survived. They adapted in ways the peaceful species of the galaxy couldn't even comprehend. The aliens began to wonder, could they even handle the kind of situations humans faced every day? When Jamie moved on to demonstrate a more complex technique, how to perform field amputations using basic materials, the tension in the room grew. His voice remained steady as he explained the importance of fast, decisive action. He talked about how, on Earth, when soldiers were trapped behind enemy lines or explorers lost in the wild, there was no time to debate or wait for medical help. Sometimes, the only choice was to save the limb to save the life, even if it meant cutting off a part of the body. The other students, many of whom had never even experienced pain in the way humans had, looked on with a mix of disbelief and unease. What kind of world did these humans live in? The very concept of cutting off a limb in a life-or-death situation seemed extreme to them. Yet the calm in Jamie's voice, the confidence in his movements, made it clear that this wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. It wasn't until a few students raised their hands, wanting to ask questions about his methods, that Jamie paused and looked at them, his eyes steady. "On Earth," he said slowly, "there's no other choice. You either act or you die. But even then, you don't get to stop fighting. Even if the odds are against you, you still try." The room fell silent as each student reflected on this strange philosophy. They came from worlds where medical treatment was advanced and effortless, where help was always just a call away, where people rarely had to face death on such a personal level. They didn't know what it was like to be forced to choose between saving a life and making an impossible sacrifice. Jamie, however, had lived that reality, and it showed in everything he did. But this was only the beginning. The professor, an esteemed alien from a peaceful planet who had watched the entire demonstration with growing concern, took a deep breath and said, "Let's move to the next part of the lesson. Let's see how well you handle more practical scenarios." Jamie nodded and stepped back, ready for whatever challenge the academy could throw his way. But the students weren't as eager. As the practice dummies were rolled in, each one designed to replicate a variety of injuries, they stared at the human with a newfound respect and fear. For them, first aid was just a textbook procedure, but for Jamie, it was a life-or-death mission, honed by years of facing the unthinkable. And as he began showing them how to deal with even more serious injuries, the room grew even quieter. This wasn't just a lesson. This was a wake-up call. The students soon realized that they weren't just learning about first aid. They were learning how to survive, how to adapt in situations they could hardly imagine. And in that moment, they knew that their perception of humans would never be the same. The Academy's first exchange student from Earth had just shattered their understanding of what it meant to be alive, and to fight to stay that way. The tension in the room was palpable as Jamie prepared for his first hands-on demonstration. The students, still shaken from his earlier words, watched intently as he placed a simulation of a chest wound on one of the medical mannequins. The scene looked harmless enough, but there was a sense of unease hanging in the air, as if everyone knew this would be anything but ordinary. In the peaceful worlds these students came from, injuries were treated quickly and calmly, but here, on Earth, even something as simple as a chest wound could be a life-or-death situation. "All right," Jamie began, his voice steady, almost too calm for the gravity of the situation. "What I'm going to show you isn't for the faint of heart. It's not about fancy tools or sterile environments. It's about survival and making decisions in seconds when there's no time for hesitation." The students, their curiosity piqued, leaned forward. They had no idea just how intense things were about to get. Jamie picked up a piece of rough cloth, the same kind he had used in his previous demonstrations. It was frayed and worn, an object that spoke of a life spent in places where survival was a daily struggle. He tore it into strips with practiced ease, his hands moving faster than anyone in the room could follow. The demonstration was about to begin, and everyone knew it wouldn't be like any other medical lesson they had ever seen. With one swift movement, Jamie pressed the fabric into the chest wound of the mannequin. It looked real, almost too real, as the deep gash in the mannequin's synthetic skin seemed to open wider. The students gasped, thinking the injury was somehow more serious than they had expected. But Jamie didn't flinch. He wasn't looking at the wound itself. He was looking at the methods of dealing with it. "You've all been taught that chest wounds can be dangerous, but that's not the half of it," Jamie said as he worked the cloth into place. "A chest wound can take a person's life in a matter of minutes if you don't act fast." He looked up, his eyes cold and focused, as if he was seeing something beyond the classroom, something more real. "The first thing you need to do," he continued, "is to stop the bleeding. This," he said, holding up a piece of the fabric, "isn't just cloth. It's a tourniquet. You won't find this kind of stuff on any fancy medical world." As Jamie worked, he explained each step in simple terms. He wasn't worried about impressing anyone. He was too focused on getting the job done. His hands moved with confidence as he pressed down on the wound, then wrapped the cloth tightly around the mannequin's chest. He spoke as though he had done this 1,000 times before, and perhaps he had. The students, however, were silent, eyes wide with disbelief. None of them had ever seen such brutal, hands-on methods of care. To them, medicine was supposed to be gentle, precise, and controlled, not aggressive and life or death. "Next step is to get the air out," Jamie muttered to himself as he moved to the next stage of the demonstration. A chest wound means air is getting into the lungs and disrupting the body's ability to breathe. You can't wait for fancy machines to help. Without hesitation, he used a simple makeshift device, a tube fashioned from one of his equipment pieces, and began to drain the air. On Earth, we don't wait for things to be perfect. We make do with what we've got. The students, still reeling from the rawness of the first aid, couldn't look away. The brutality of it all, the efficiency, the coldness, the relentless drive to save life, no matter the cost, was both shocking and mesmerizing. They had never imagined that saving a life could feel like such a violent, desperate act. But for Jamie, it was nothing more than routine. His movements were swift and sure, not out of aggression, but out of a deep, ingrained understanding that every second counted. One of the students, an alien from a serene, peaceful planet, raised a shaky hand. "But is this really necessary? Wouldn't it be easier to just use a medbot or call for assistance?" Jamie didn't answer right away. Instead, he finished his task and stepped back, taking a moment to assess the situation. The wound was under control for now. He could see the doubt in the eyes of the student, the uncertainty about the harshness of his methods. He looked at them all, the peaceful, calm faces of beings who had never experienced the world Jamie had come from. "You can call for help all you want," Jamie said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any of them expected. "But when you're stranded in a war zone, when you're alone, when there's no one to help you, there are no medbots. There are no perfect solutions. You either do what you can with what you have, or you die." The room was completely still. No one spoke. Jamie's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating any sense of comfort the students had once felt. This wasn't a lesson in basic first aid anymore. It was a lesson in survival, and it was one they weren't sure they were ready for. After a long, tense silence, Jamie moved on to the next part of the demonstration. But the students weren't focused on the next steps anymore. They were still trying to process what had just happened. The lesson wasn't about healing. It was about the price of healing, about what it meant to act when there was no room for hesitation. The professor, a seasoned alien with decades of medical experience, spoke up, though his voice wavered slightly. "Is this really how you treat wounds on your world?" His tone was a mix of disbelief and fascination. Jamie looked at him, and for the first time, a shadow of something passed over his face, a brief flicker of sadness, or perhaps regret. "On Earth, we don't have the luxury of waiting," Jamie replied softly. "Sometimes we have to make choices that no one else can understand." He turned back to the mannequin, finishing the procedure, his hands moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of necessity, not practice. The students watched as Jamie wrapped the wound up tightly, securing the makeshift bandage. He stood up, glancing at the class one final time. The chest wound was no longer a threat. It was controlled, manageable, but only because Jamie had acted without hesitation. He had made a choice, and in that choice, he had reminded them all that there was a different kind of medicine in the galaxy, one forged in the fires of survival. "Any other questions?" Jamie asked, his voice cold and final. The class was silent, but the answer was clear. They had just learned something they hadn't even known they needed to understand. The true nature of first aid, the kind that saved lives, no matter how brutal, no matter the cost. The room had been quiet for a few minutes, the students still processing the raw demonstration they had just witnessed. It was a momentary silence, broken only by the soft hum of the lights overhead. Then, a loud crash shattered the calm. followed by a sharp scream that immediately put everyone on high alert. Jamie's head snapped towards the noise, his instincts kicking in before his mind had time to process the situation. Without a second thought, he was moving, his feet pounding the floor as he rushed to the source of the sound. The students watched in stunned disbelief as Jamie reached the incident area in a matter of seconds, his eyes scanning the scene with the intensity of a seasoned soldier. In front of him stood one of the students, an alien with bright green skin, his face contorted in agony. The alien had knocked over a glass container during the demonstration, and the acidic liquid inside was now splashing across the floor, and more dangerously, across the student's exposed arm. "Get the medkit. Now," Jamie barked, his voice cold and urgent. The others scrambled to obey, but Jamie didn't wait. He dropped to the student's side, his hands already moving with the practiced speed of someone who had been in life-or-death situations 100 times before. The acid was already eating away at the alien's skin, its burning effect unmistakable. The alien's flesh bubbled and hissed where the acid touched, and the smell, sharp, acrid, burned the air. It was a gruesome sight, one that sent a chill down the spines of the students watching from a safe distance. "Hold still," Jamie ordered, his voice almost a whisper now, as he assessed the injury. Every second counted. The acid was a powerful compound, and it was clear that if Jamie didn't act immediately, the damage would be irreversible. His mind raced, pulling from every survival skill he had learned on Earth, from every life-or-death situation he had faced before. There was no time for hesitation, no time for thinking about whether the alien's biology was compatible with his methods. This was a matter of life or death. Jamie's hands were steady as he pulled a strip of fabric from his gear. He had no medbot, no high-tech healing tools, only the basic supplies he carried with him. On Earth, they didn't wait for the perfect solution. They acted with what they had. "Quick, get some water," Jamie commanded, his eyes not leaving the alien's arm. The acid was still burning, the skin visibly melting under the corrosive touch. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the shock of knowing that something was eating away at you, slowly and relentlessly. One of the students, an alien from a lush jungle planet, rushed over with a container of water. Jamie snatched it from the student's hands, not bothering with pleasantries. He poured the water directly onto the acid-burned skin, not caring about the mess, not caring about anything other than getting the acid off before it did any more damage. The water splashed across the wound, instantly neutralizing the acid's burn. The reaction was almost immediate, but the damage had already been done. The alien's skin was still smoking, the surface tissue destroyed beyond recognition. Jamie's face didn't show panic, but his mind was calculating quickly. He grabbed a handful of gauze from his bag and pressed it against the wound, trying to stem any further damage. The alien's pained scream echoed in the room, but Jamie barely flinched. The worst was over, but the recovery was going to be long and painful. "Listen to me," Jamie said, his voice low but firm as he spoke directly to the alien. "We've got this under control now, but we need to get you to a medical bay ASAP. You're not going to die from this, but it's going to hurt. Do you understand?" The alien, still trembling with pain, nodded weakly. The acid had done its work, but Jamie's quick thinking had kept the situation from escalating further. Still, the wound was severe, an injury that would leave permanent scars, a constant reminder of the brutality of the universe. The alien's skin, once smooth and vibrant, was now a network of deep burns and raw tissue. Jamie worked swiftly, wrapping the wound tightly with the gauze and securing it with a makeshift bandage. As the other students gathered around, some of them whispering nervously, Jamie took a step back and surveyed the situation. His mind, always quick in times of crisis, now focused on the aftermath. There was no glory in this, no thrill, just the grim reality of what he had just done. He had saved a life, yes, but he also knew that this was only the beginning of the alien's long recovery. The damage done by the acid would leave scars, both physical and emotional. But Jamie couldn't afford to dwell on that now. "Everyone, listen up," Jamie said, turning to face the group of students. His tone was serious, cutting through the murmur of worry. "What you just saw wasn't a simulation. This wasn't some textbook example. This was real. And if it wasn't for quick thinking, that alien would have lost his arm, maybe his life." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. He could see the students were shaken. Some of them were trying to hide it, but others couldn't mask the fear on their faces. Jamie didn't blame them. He had expected this. His methods, the brutal honesty of the universe, had been foreign to them, and that was fine. They were learning, slowly, that survival was not a clean, sterile process. The alien who had been injured, now stabilized but still groaning in pain, looked up at Jamie with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "You saved me," he said, his voice raspy. "But why so harsh? There must be a better way." Jamie's gaze softened for a moment, but the hardness of his expression didn't fade. "In the real world," he said, his voice quieter now, "there isn't always a better way. Sometimes you don't have time for the perfect solution. You just do what's necessary to survive." He stood up, wiping his hands on his pants as he looked around at the students. "Take note. This is why we train. The universe isn't kind. It doesn't care about your species or your peace treaties. It doesn't care if you're ready. But when it comes down to it, we fight. We survive. And we help those who can still be saved." As the room fell silent, the students realized that the lesson Jamie had taught them wasn't just about first aid. It was about survival, about facing the brutal truths of the universe, and about understanding that sometimes the difference between life and death was not in the tools you had, but in the choices you made when faced with the worst of situations. The alien with the acid burn, still in pain, nodded slowly, his mind starting to accept the harsh reality Jamie had shown them. There were no guarantees in life, not for anyone, not for any species. But the choice to fight for survival was always theirs. The air in the cavern was thick with tension, every breath feeling heavier than the last. The walls were lined with ancient runes that glowed faintly in the dark, casting an eerie light across the group of aliens standing in a semicircle. It was as if the very stones themselves held secrets, secrets from a time long past. At the center, an altar stood, made of dark stone, worn down by millennia of existence, yet it remained unyielding, unbroken. Above the altar, symbols of an ancient language floated in midair, shifting and pulsing with a light that seemed to come from nowhere. These symbols had no direct meaning to the participants, but they understood one thing: whoever could decipher them would gain immense power. The participants were diverse, each from a different planet, each with their own reasons for being here, each drawn to the trial by a force beyond their understanding. There was Kranth, a massive alien with skin as dark as the night sky. His 4 muscular arms crossed over his chest as he glared at the altar. His species was known for their brutal strength, but the trial was not about power. It was about something far more dangerous: knowledge. Beside him stood Vira, a delicate being from a planet of endless forests, her translucent wings shimmering in the dim light. Her people were known for their intelligence, their ability to understand complex algorithms that no one else could. Then there was Threx, a strange creature with 5 eyes and skin that changed color with every thought. He had come for a reason unknown to anyone, even to himself. At the farthest point of the circle was Zala, a small, agile alien whose planet was known for its deadly wildlife. Zala had survived countless dangers, and yet stood frozen, as if she had seen something in the symbols above the altar that no one else could see. Her eyes flicked to the others, and for a moment, the silence between them all deepened. Everyone knew the importance of the trial, but no one knew the cost. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern, and all eyes turned toward the figure emerging from the shadows. The figure was tall, draped in robes that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly presence. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but the aura around him was undeniable. The Ancient One, the keeper of the trial. He had seen countless races come and go, each seeking the power that the trial promised. But only a select few had ever succeeded. "Welcome, challengers," the keeper's voice rang out, deep and resonant, echoing off the cavern walls. "You have been chosen to face the trial, a test that has existed longer than your species, longer than even the stars themselves. But understand this, not all who enter will leave. Some will find the power they seek, others will find only the weight of their own failure." There was a collective pause as each participant processed the keeper's words. The room seemed to close in on them, and a strange feeling began to stir in their stomachs. This wasn't a test they had prepared for. This wasn't something that could be easily conquered. The keeper raised his hand, and the symbols in the air shifted, rearranging themselves into a pattern that none of the aliens could comprehend. They swirled and turned like liquid, twisting into shapes that seemed to defy logic. "You must each step forward, one by one. The symbols will show you your trial. Only by confronting your deepest fears can you hope to survive." Kranth stepped forward first, his broad chest puffed out in a show of confidence. His species was known for their courage, their ability to fight through any obstacle. But as soon as his foot crossed the line, the symbols around the altar flared brightly. Kranth's expression faltered for the first time as he was struck by a sudden vision. A vision of his people, their cities, their homes, burning to the ground. He could hear the screams of his people, see the bodies of his kin scattered across a blood-soaked battlefield. The fear, the loss, it was overwhelming. Kranth's fists clenched, but he held his ground. He knew what this was, a test of his strength. The vision faded as quickly as it came, and Kranth stood tall, his chest heaving with the weight of what he had just witnessed. But he had not failed. He had overcome. Next was Vaira. She stepped forward with hesitation, her wings fluttering slightly as the symbols began to twist again. But this time, the vision that struck her was far different. It wasn't her people she saw, but her own mind, her intellect. She saw herself failing, watching as her sharp mind faltered under pressure. She watched herself make a simple mistake, a calculation that led to the downfall of an entire civilization. The fear of failure was a deep one for her, for without her intellect, she felt lost. But Vaira held steady, fighting back the suffocating panic. The vision faded, and she was left standing, relieved but shaken. She had passed her trial, though it had not been easy. Threx, ever the enigma, stepped forward last. His 5 eyes narrowed as the symbols above the altar danced. The vision that struck him was not one of physical danger or failure. It was a vision of his own identity unraveling. He saw himself, not as the being he had always known, but as something else entirely. He was no longer Threx. He was a stranger to himself, lost in an ocean of shifting colors and conflicting thoughts. The sense of self was what Threx had always relied upon, and now it was crumbling. It was the deepest fear of his kind, to lose themselves, to lose their very essence. Threx staggered, but then he did something unexpected. He embraced the chaos. "I am more than this," he whispered to himself, and the vision shattered like glass. Zala was the final one. She had seen the others struggle, had seen their fears manifest in front of them. But Zala wasn't afraid of the same things. She had faced death on her planet every day, had survived things that would break most beings. What she feared, though, was weakness. To be powerless in the face of danger was something she could not bear. As she stepped forward, the symbols above the altar shifted, and the vision that hit her was not an image, but a sensation. She felt the ground slip away beneath her, the world spinning, and she found herself helpless, unable to fight, unable to save herself. It was a feeling she had never known, and it threatened to swallow her whole. But Zala fought. With a breath, she forced herself to face the sensation, to acknowledge it, and slowly she regained control. The trial was over. The keeper stepped forward, his eyes glowing from within his hood. He surveyed each of them, Kranth, Vera, Threx, and Zala, and nodded. You have all faced the trial and overcome. But remember, true power does not lie in what you seek. It lies in what you are willing to confront. The cavern's lights dimmed, and the symbols faded into the stone. The trial had been completed, but the journey was far from over. They had won the trial, but they had also learned something about themselves, something that would shape their futures forever. As the group turned to leave, the keeper's voice echoed one last time, a warning in the stillness. Be wary, for the true test begins now. The galaxy was vast, too vast for any one species to ever hope to understand fully. For millennia, countless alien races had existed, each with their own technologies, customs, and perspectives. The universe seemed a well-ordered place, with established rules of survival and conquest, until one fateful day, everything changed. It all started with a single ship, a ship unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Captain Lyra, commander of the Earth ship Ocelot, had been leading her crew on a routine patrol in the outer rim of the galaxy. Earth, a young and relatively unnoticed planet by the standards of galactic powers, had been quietly building its forces for decades. Lyra's ship was equipped with the latest technologies, not the most advanced in the galaxy, but innovative enough to attract attention. What no one had expected was that this ship would become the spark that ignited a firestorm that would ultimately change the galaxy's entire perspective on humanity. Lyra sat at the bridge, her gaze locked on the holographic map that displayed their current location in space. The stars stretched out before her, the vast emptiness between them both mesmerizing and terrifying. The crew was busy with their tasks, checking systems and maintaining the ship. The Ocelot was sleek and designed for stealth, a ship built to explore and, if necessary, defend humanity's interests in the far reaches of space. But today, it wasn't exploration that brought them here. It was something far more ominous. The alert came suddenly, flashing red across the map. An unidentified fleet had entered their sector, and they were moving fast. Lyra's hand flew to the controls, zooming in on the coordinates. The fleet was composed of several massive ships, unmistakable in their design. It was the Zhar'Khan Empire, a race known for their brutality and dominance over any race they encountered. The Zhar'Khan had been a thorn in humanity's side for years, and their reputation preceded them. Ruthless warriors, conquering and enslaving entire planets. They had a history of wiping out entire civilizations for the slightest provocation. Lyra's mind raced. The Ocelot was alone here. The fleet was much larger, and despite its advanced technology, Earth was not prepared for a battle of this magnitude. She had a decision to make: retreat or stand and fight. Her hand hovered over the communication panel. To call for backup meant that the fleet would get closer to their homeworld, and humanity had to avoid showing weakness. Standing up to the Zhar'Khan would show them that Earth was not to be underestimated, but the risk was immense. Lyra took a deep breath and made her choice. "Prepare for battle," she said, her voice calm but firm. The crew responded immediately, falling into a well-practiced routine. The weapons systems powered up, shields were raised, and the ship's engines hummed with anticipation. Lyra ordered the ship to move into a defensive position, taking advantage of nearby asteroids as cover. The Zhar'Khan fleet was closing in fast, their massive warships bristling with weapons. The Ocelot wasn't designed for head-to-head combat, but it was fast and maneuverable. They would need to use every trick in their playbook. The Zhar'Khan commander, Lord Korik, was a seasoned veteran, and he wasn't used to being defied. He sent out a communication, his voice booming with the arrogance of someone who knew he could crush anything in his path. "Human, this is your final warning. Surrender now, and we may spare your life. Resist, and we will erase your planet from existence." Lyra's response was simple and defiant. "We will not surrender." The battle that followed was fierce. The Ocelot darted through the debris field, evading the enemy's heavy fire with skillful maneuvers. The Zhar'Khan ships fired relentlessly, their weapons cracking the asteroids around them. For hours, the small Earth ship fought back, outmaneuvering the larger fleet and striking with pinpoint accuracy. Every successful hit by the Ocelot felt like a small victory. But despite their efforts, they couldn't afford to keep this up for long. The Zhar'Khan were relentless, and the Ocelot was being slowly worn down. Then, in a sudden shift of fate, a critical moment arrived. Lyra spotted an opening in the formation of the Zhar'Khan fleet. It was a weakness, a gap in their defense that could be exploited. With a quick command, she ordered the crew to focus all energy on the engines. The Ocelot surged forward at full speed, dodging fire from the Zhar'Khan ships as they tried to close the gap. With a deep breath, Lyra made a bold move. She ordered the ship to fire a concentrated pulse of energy directly into the Zhar'Khan command ship, aiming for its core. The Ocelot's advanced targeting system locked on, and the blast ripped through the enemy ship's shields, striking the heart of their vessel. The explosion was massive, lighting up the space around them. The shockwave sent the remaining Zhar'Khan ships into disarray. The tide of battle had turned, but the victory came at a cost. The Ocelot was badly damaged, and many of its systems were offline. The crew was exhausted, but they had managed to do the impossible. The Zhar'Khan fleet was retreating, their command ship in ruins, and the rest of their fleet in disarray. It was a victory that no one had seen coming, a victory that would change the galaxy's view of humanity. The news of the battle spread quickly across the galaxy. At first, it was met with disbelief. Humanity had defeated the Zhar'Khan. Impossible. The idea that a young race could stand up to one of the most feared empires in the galaxy was laughable. But the truth was undeniable. The Ocelot had done it, and the Zhar'Khan were retreating. Word of humanity's unexpected victory spread, and the galaxy began to take notice. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer a race to be ignored. They had the strength, the resolve, and the cunning to fight back when threatened, and they would not go down without a fight. In the following months, Earth's reputation began to shift. Other galactic powers, once dismissive of humanity, started taking them seriously. The Zhar'Khan, humiliated by their defeat, withdrew from many territories. Their influence diminished. New alliances formed, and old enemies reconsidered their strategies. The galaxy was changing, and at the heart of it all was one undeniable truth. Humanity was no longer just a footnote in the history of the stars. For Captain Lyra and her crew, it was a bittersweet victory. They had proven themselves, but they had also become symbols of a new era. The universe had been forced to look at humanity in a new light, and there was no turning back. The galaxy's perspective had changed forever. As Lyra gazed out at the stars from the bridge of the Ocelot, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held. One thing was certain: humanity had earned its place among the stars, and no one would ever forget the day they changed the galaxy's perspective.